Jnanam paramam dhyayam. Knowledge is supreme.
Let us summarize what we have seen in the last couple of lectures. We looked at the different steps which are involved in catalytic reaction. We observed that there are 7 steps that are involved. There is external diffusion, there is internal diffusion, there is adsorption of the gas species onto the catalyst site, and there is a surface reaction, then there is desorption, then we have internal diffusion which carries the product species to the external surface of the pellet, and from there is external diffusion which takes the product species to the bulk gas phase. And we also looked at what happens if the each of these different steps could be the rate limiting step, and we looked at how to synthesize rate law by taking decomposition of cumene example to see how the different overall reaction rate is different when each of these different steps are actually controlling or rate controlling or is a rate limiting step. Okay. So this idea of synthesizing rate law the procedure that we prescribed in the last class, where we first postulate a mechanism, assume the rate controlling step, find the rate law and validate with experiments. So this procedure can actually be followed for any different mechanism that is actually used. So for instance, in the previous lectures we have looked at single site mechanism, we have looked at dual site mechanism, we have looked at LED deal mechanism. So each of these can actually be used in the mechanism, and one can actually follow these steps to actually find the rate law and validate with experimental data. So it turns out that different reactions actually satisfy different mechanisms. In fact, different mechanisms govern different reactions, and so one can actually try different combinations of these mechanisms and synthesize the rate law and actually compare it with the experimental data. Recall that the experimental data typically will be experiment done at a specific temperature or maybe at different temperatures. So you fix a temperature and then change the partial pressure of the gas and measure the observables, and we can validate the model or the rate law that is actually derived using the method proposed here with the experimental data, and that will actually give confidence whether the assumed mechanism and the rate controlling step that is assumed is actually correct for the reaction that is being considered. So let us look at another case now. So in all the earlier examples and the mechanism we have considered, we assume that the adsorption step is reversible. We assume that surface reaction is also a reversible step. We assume that desorption step is also a reversible step. We in fact observed in the example of ammonia synthesis where one of the adsorption step was actually an irreversible step. So we will see an example now as to what if one of the steps or maybe more steps are actually irreversible. How to find rate law? in these cases. How to find rate law when one or more steps which are involved in catalytic reaction are actually irreversible. So, what we will see in this lecture is to understand how to actually synthesize rate law when there is an irreversible step that may be present. So, the strategy here is to look at the balances for, or look at the rate of generation of all the intermediate species and to assume pseudo-steady state for these. So, one can assume a pseudo-steady state hypothesis for these species, and once we assume a pseudo-steady state hypothesis, we can assume that the rate of generation of each of these intermediate species, whichever is relevant, we can assume that each of these rates are actually 0, and that approximation can be used to find the rate law. So, this is a method which can be used when there are irreversible steps which are actually present in the catalytic reaction. If one of these 7 steps that we outlined earlier, if some of these are actually irreversible, for example, adsorption, surface reaction and desorption, which are, if these 3 are actually, any one or more of these 3 are actually irreversible step, then one can actually use a pseudo steady state hypothesis. Let us take a specific example of isomerization of N-pentene. So, the reaction is N-pentene forms isomerized form, isomerization, and actually happens over alumina catalyst. So, the mechanism is actually a single site mechanism. So, we use a single site mechanism. We use a single site mechanism. So, let us say that N-pentene is represented as N and I-pentene is isomerized pentene is represented as I, and N adsorbs onto the site, which is actually, it's a reversible adsorption step. It's a reversible adsorption step, and then we assume that NS irreversibly forms IS, and this is the surface reaction, and assume that it is irreversible surface reaction, reversible step, and then we assume that IS actually reversibly undergoes a desorption process. So, we assume that the N-pentene actually interacts with the active sites and forms the bound species N dot S, and we assume that this adsorption step is actually reversible, and we assume that the adsorbed species irreversibly undergoes a surface reaction, and then we assume that the adsorbed product species IS actually reversibly desorbs from the active sites, leaving the active site free. So, let us look at how to generate how to synthesize the rate law for this particular case. So, let us assume that surface reaction is rate controlling. Let us assume that surface reaction is rate controlling, and since the reaction is actually a irreversible reaction, then the overall rate is essentially given by the surface reaction, which is given by Ks into Cns. Let us assume that it is first order, and then suppose let us say we consider the net rate of generation of the other species So, R Ns is essentially given by, this is an intermediate. So, if I put a star to represent the intermediate, rate of generation of the intermediates. So, Kn into partial pressure of N-pentene into vacant site. So, this is the rate at which the species is getting adsorbed onto the site, minus the desorption step, which again affects the total species, minus the surface reaction actually takes the species attached to the sites to a product form, and let us say that similarly for Is is given by Ks into Cns, that is the rate at which the species is formed, and let us assume that the desorption step is Ki into Cis plus into Cv. So, that is the rate at which the desorption process is happening. So, the first equation here, the first rate is the rate of formation of this intermediate species Ns, and this is the rate of formation of this intermediate species. So, in pseudo-steady state hypothesis method, we assume that the rate at which the intermediates are formed is actually equal to 0. So, from here we will find out what is Cns, and we will find out what is Cns and substitute that in this expression, and then we are done. We will be able to find what is the overall rate of reaction. So, let us do this exercise. So, what we need to find is, we need to find Cns from the expression equal to 0 and 0, and also we can use the conservation rule. We will use the conservation rule for the total number of sites, and once we find Cns, then we can actually find out what is the rate at which the overall reaction rate, which is essentially given by Ks into Cns. So, let us do this exercise. So, from the pseudo-steady state equations, we can find out that Cns is essentially given by Kn into Pn into Cv divided by K minus n plus Ks. So, this essentially comes from this expression here. So, Cns is essentially given by this divided by sum of these two coefficients, and in a similar fashion we can find out that Cis is essentially given by Ks into Cns divided by Ks into Cns plus divided by Ki, but we know what Cns is, so we can substitute that here. So, that will be equal to Ks, Kn, Pn, Cv divided by K minus n plus Ks minus I Pi into Cv divided by Ki. So, now we know what is Cns and we know what is Cis, and we know that the conservation rule is essentially given by Ct Cv plus Cns plus Cis. So, we will substitute this in the conservation rule, and by substituting this in the conservation rule we can find out what is the expression for Cv. So, Ct is equal to Cv plus Kn Pn into Cv divided by K minus n plus Ks, that plus Ks, Kn, Pn, Cv divided by Ks into Ki plus Ki Pi into Cv divided by Ki. So, from here we can find out that Cv is equal to Ct divided by 1 plus Kn Pn divided by k minus n plus ks plus ks kn pn divided by k minus n plus ks into ki plus k minus I pi divided by ki. We can simplify this and rewrite this as Cv is equal to, we can simplify this and write as Cv equal to Ct divided by 1 plus capital Kn, which is essentially given by ratio of small kn by. So, if I define capital Kn as small kn by k minus n, which is essentially the absorption equilibrium constant. So, that is equal to Pn divided by 1 plus Ks by k minus n plus Ks by Ki into Kn Pn divided by 1 plus Ks by k minus n plus Pi divided by Ki. So, if I define Ki as, if I define capital Ki as k minus I plus Ki, then I can essentially write this, if Ki is the adsorption equilibrium constant of species I. So, essentially this is k minus I by Ki. I can write this as k minus I by Ki. So, for this Cv I can substitute now back in C and S, and that I can substitute in the expression for Rn overall reaction rate. So, overall reaction rate will essentially be equal to Ks into Cns, and that is equal to Ks into Kn into Ct into Pn divided by 1 plus Ks by k minus n multiplied by 1 plus capital Kn Pn divided by 1 plus Ks by Kn multiplied by 1 plus Ks divided by Ki plus capital Ki into Pi. So, that will be the expression for the overall reaction rate. So, let me repeat, it will be equal to Ks, which is the rate at which the surface reaction happens, Kn is the adsorption equilibrium constant for N-pentene, Ct is the concentration, total concentration of the sites, Pn is the partial pressure of N-pentene, 1 plus ratio of the rate constant for the surface reaction. Remember that the surface reaction is irreversible here, and divided by the desorption constant of the N-pentene, and then we have 1 plus Kn Pn divided by 1 plus Ks by k minus n, 1 plus Ks by Ki plus Ki into Pi, where this is the equilibrium constant for equilibrium adsorption constant for species I. So, now from this expression one can actually see what are the limiting cases. So, this is the actual expression that actually governs the rate at which the overall reaction is happening. Suppose we assume that, if we assume that Ks by Kn is very small, suppose we assume that Ks by K1 is much smaller than 1, and we also assume that Ks by Ki is much smaller than 1, then we will see that the overall rate is essentially boils down to Ks, Kn, Pn, Ct divided by 1 plus Kn, Pn plus Ki into Pi. So, one can actually look at such limiting cases, and such limiting cases would actually tell you what is the overall rate law for different situations. one can actually obtain the same expression by assuming the rates of each of these steps and assuming that the surface reaction is the rate controlling step, and one can actually find the same expression, but using pseudo steady state hypothesis method actually provides an elegant way of finding rate law when some of these steps are actually irreversible. So, what we have seen so far is we have actually seen how to synthesize rate law if steps are reversible. We have seen how to do it if there are irreversible steps. So, if we have looked at how to find the rate law, any or more of these steps are actually reversible, any or more of these steps are actually irreversible. So, let us now briefly look at the temperature dependence. So, rate law is of course a function of temperature. Will be a function of temperature. So, let us look at what could be the temperature dependence for the case that we have just looked at. So, the rate law for let us say the isomerization that we arrived at, let us say that our n prime is essentially given by some rate constant k into Pn, which is the partial pressure of n pentene divided by 1 plus Kn Pn plus K1 Ki Pi. What we have done is we have essentially pooled in the different rate constants in the numerator. We said that Ks, Kn, Pn is equal to k. So, we have just assumed that these three constants, these three into Ct, we have assumed that Ks, Kn into Ct, where this is the total concentration of the active sites, that is equal to k, and clearly this rate law will certainly be a function of temperature, and in fact this k actually follows Arrhenius dependence. Whereas the adsorption of the species is also exothermic. So, if temperature increases, then Ka, Kn and Ki actually become smaller. So, that is the typical relationship with the temperature, and so clearly rate law also is a function of temperature. So, what we have seen in this topic so far is we have actually looked at catalysis, we have defined catalysis, we have looked at various steps that are involved, we have looked at synthesis of rate law using two different methods, and these two methods can be used for different mechanisms. What we will see from the next lecture is to deduce the rate law from the experimental data. The challenge is, once the experimental data is there, what should be the functional form of the rate law that would actually approximately govern the experimental observations, because mechanism can be very detailed and there can be many steps, there are many ways to formulate mechanism, and it is not possible to do all combinations. So, the next best option is, given an experimental data, can we approximately deduce what should be the mechanism that governs the given experimental observations, and what could be the proposed or approximately what should be the functional form of the rate law, can it be deduced from the experimental data using intuitive methods. So, this is what we will start seeing from the next lecture. Thank you.